So can you all hear me and see me all right?
Yeah.
Great, good. Well, I'd like to thank the organizers of Breaking Convention for their tireless efforts in putting together this event and extending their generous invitation to me to discuss certain aspects of the DMT experience. And I'm delighted to see the attention being given to DMT at this week's meeting. So I entitled my presentation and wrote the abstract before learning that the emphasis on today's meeting, or on today's panel, was going to be the beings. And because of the focus of the panel, I'll devote more of my time to various models for understanding the beings, rather than follow the lines of the abstract that I presented. A couple of thoughts came to mind while I was listening to the other presenters this afternoon. One of them had to do with the distinction between consensus reality or objective reality and subjective reality. And it's interesting within the context of the pharmacology and biology of DMT. It's been known for close to 40 years that DMT is actively transported into the brain across the blood-brain barrier, and the brain only does that with certain certain compounds that are required for its normal function, like glucose and certain amino acids necessary for protein formation. So it's as if it's as if the brain requires narrow window, as it were, of concentrations of DMT in order to maintain its normal function. And normal brain function equates with normal consciousness, everyday consciousness. So it might be the case that a certain amount of DMT is mediating or regulating everyday homeostasis of our perceptual reality. In my first DMT book, I like to refer to DMT as a reality thermostat, that if concentrations increase in the brain to a large amount, things become DMT-like, and if they're reduced, then things become rather flat and lifeless. So something else which has been discovered, and this is more recent, is that the retina appears to produce quite high levels of the activity of the gene, which is responsible for the enzyme that completes the synthesis of DMT. So it's not yet been established, that there is DMT in the retina, but there are strong indications that it is. So the influence of DMT might be felt in both our everyday awareness of normal reality and in particular visual reality. So those are a couple of the ideas that came to mind. Oh, also, so listening to Daniel's DPT experience reminds me of us having dinner together a number of years ago in Manhattan when we were filming the DMT documentary. And at a certain point, Daniel turned to me and he said, "Have you ever done DPT?" And I said, "After reading your account, Daniel, I don't think I want to." So it was an interesting exchange there. So most of you are familiar with the DMT research we performed at the University of New Mexico in the 1990s. There were two results of my research that were unexpected by both myself and the volunteers in the study, and in many ways led me back to the drawing board to come up with a new model for the DMT effect. One of these findings was the highly interactive and relational nature of the DMT state, as opposed to the unitive mystical white light void experience, which is more commonly. Will we attempt to weaponize them and will they attempt to weaponize us? So these are some of the same questions that come to mind when speaking about ETs and the ET phenomena. You can speculate about a spectrum of contact with ETs, either a purely consciousness to consciousness level of contact or a more physical to physical level of contact. For the purposes of our discussion and my presentation this afternoon, it's more focused on the consciousness to consciousness aspect of the phenomena. Okay, so those are basically my prepared comments. If there's any questions, maybe we can entertain them.
Thank you very much. We have some time for 5 minutes for questions. Please do speak up so Rick can hear. If you can't hear, I'll repeat the question. So, does anybody have a question there? Yes.
I'd like to know how do you relate your work to the work?
Next slide. So shamanism also posits the external reality of the beings in a parallel, usually invisible universe. In this context, they are usually understood to be spirits of nature and are invoked for their power, such as healing and harming and so on. Next slide. The new model I've articulated relies upon the notions of the spiritual world as articulated in the Hebrew Bible and as explicated by the medieval Jewish philosophers such as Maimonides. In particular, the prophetic state, and I define the prophetic state as any spiritual experience in the Bible. It may include foretelling or prediction, but isn't necessary for the definition that I use. So the prophetic state is the paradigmatic spiritual experience described in the Hebrew Bible. And the metaphysics developed by the medievalists proposed that the observed phenomena are externally real and in fact possess a greater reality valence than normal everyday reality. They propose that the beings are intermediaries between an incomprehensible and imperceptible God and a comprehensible and perceptible universe. In my new book describing the relationship of the DMT state and the prophetic experience, I propose that endogenous DMT, somehow stimulated in the figures of the Bible, may mediate the apprehensive form or content of these intermediaries, in other words, the beings. In this context, the primary function of the beings is to teach, and specifically they are teaching ethical monotheism, the nature and existence of the one God and the golden rule. In other words, understanding of the spiritual world and how to relate to each other and the outside world. So in summary then, the beings may be thoroughly objective, or they may be sensible, or they may be sensible representations of either subjective or objective forces or processes. Next slide. So as in subjective things, the beings may represent our own psychology, in which case their nature would be like that of a dream's contents. At the most superficial level, they may represent residual feelings or thoughts that linger barely consciously in the backs of our minds. At a deeper level, they may be symbolic representations of more significant emotional dynamics that have been previously unconscious. For example, a healing being may represent a healthcare provider for whom we have strong attachments to that we cannot express in our everyday life. These psychological notions pull from the implicit assumption of the term psychedelic referring to it being mind manifesting. Our perception or apprehension of the beings reflects the workings of our minds. Next slide. In thinking of them as objective beings, we might understand them as residing in alternative levels of reality, such as dark matter or parallel universes. Modified consciousness resulting from elevated brain levels of DMT, either naturally occurring in non-drug spiritual states or externally administered in other settings, allows us to peer directly into these realms and thus view their contents, including their inhabitants. One approach to assess the objective nature of the beings would be to develop instruments, for example, that would allow us to capture images of what exists in dark matter or parallel universes. And by comparing those images to descriptions of the DMT state, we would be able to determine how closely they resemble each other. If they do, we would more confidently be able to propose an external location of the phenomena. Next slide. So finally, the beings may be sensible representations of intrinsically encountered after using 5-methoxy-DMT. So both the volunteers and I were expecting, as the ultimate effect of the DMT experience, emerging with the white light, grounded being in a formless, content-free, ego-dissolving state of Eastern religious enlightenment. And this was because of both of our interests in and practice of Eastern religious meditations. Instead, the research subjects found themselves in a very busy world of light, which was filled with sentience and willful intelligence, and which with the volunteers interacted in a highly fulsome manner. In this non-corporeal world, one's sense of personality was highly maintained. It was possible to direct one's attention willfully, to make decisions, to follow the temporal continuity of the sequences of experiences and so on. The other finding was how volunteers appraised the reality bases of their experiences. There was near unanimity in the sense that the DMT world felt as real or more real than everyday reality. In addition, it was also nearly unanimous that volunteers noted that the DMT effect was not like a dream or a hallucination or even comparable to other psychedelic drug effects. In my developing various models for the objectivity and or subjectivity of the DMT world, in particular the beings, I have found it useful to place them on a spectrum, one pole of which is the bottom up and the other pole being top down. So first slide, please. The Neurotheology Model is the reigning paradigm for understanding the biology of spiritual experience, and it proposes that the contents of the spiritual experience are the subjective correlates of certain brain states, which are a response or a reflex, which are triggered by certain stimuli such as fasting, prayer, meditation, or psychedelic drugs. This is the more or less model of this is your brain on drugs paradigm, especially the hard neurotheology model. The brain generates the subjective experience, and it is not objectively real. At the same time, there are evolutionary advantages to the brain being so configured, such as altruism or creativity. Next slide. So the psychoanalytic or the depth psychology model also doesn't propose the objective reality of the beings. Rather, they are symbolic representations of unconscious psychological conflicts or drives or constructs or movements towards wholeness. They provide access to psychological healing or growth, especially when approached with the aid of a psychotherapist. Next slide. The spiritual model with which I approached my research was that of Zen Buddhism. And so this discipline also doesn't treat the contents of the DMT state as objectively real. Rather, it looks, it regards all of the visions and the voices resulting from meditation practice as mind-brain detritus that is being shed on the way towards the formless, enlightened state. Well, so some schools of Tibetan Buddhism place more emphasis on these other worlds and appear to me to be a hybrid of bone shamanism from Tibet overlaid with Buddhist notions. And as also is the case with shamanism, these spirits' energies are being channeled for various purposes. So next slide. The first of the top-down models is what we might configure through notions increasingly discussed in modern physics. In this model, one might speculate that DMT changes the receiving characteristics of the mind-brain complex pharmacologically, which then allows us to peer into externally real but normally invisible spectra of physical realities such as dark matter or parallel universes, insensible processes or forces. For example, the beings appear to consist of light, but this may not be their true nature, but only a visible manifestation of a particular type of process, akin to how a flame visibly expresses the operation of combustion. We see a flame rather than oxygen attaching itself to other molecules. Our perceptual apparatus, as it were, can only see what it is capable of seeing. Next slide. So let's expand the field of the term psychedelic to include how our minds apprehend processes or forces that are externally, not internally existent. I believe that by doing so, we can interpret the beings as representing previously invisible external objects or forces. However, rather than suggesting that the mind generates these images, this idea proposes that the mind affects it affects how we perceive external objects or forces, how they manifest in our minds. So we apprehend the beings in a more or less clear manner, depending on the degree of overlay from our own psychology, biology, training, education. If all of these variables are operating at their optimal levels, we apprehend in as unadulterated a manner as possible those external things. And the less well-developed those faculties, the more we muddy our observations of these external things with our own internal workings, our wishes, hopes, conflicts, ignorances, and so on. So that muddying results in our subjective experience being more of a mirror and less of a window. So what are the external forces that these beings may represent? They may include healing and illness, strength and weakness, love and hate, evil and good, wisdom and ignorance, strength and weakness, love and hate, evil and good, wisdom and folly. Using the medieval Jewish philosophers' metaphysics, these are what one might consider God's intermediaries, the vehicles through which godly influence or emanation or overflow works in the universe. So, for example, the angel Raphael may represent healing forces, the angel Gabriel, the force of strength. These world-affecting forces manifest in a apprehensible, visual, somatic, other modalities using the repertoires that our minds possess. So this model of the beings adds an additional level of sophistication to a discussion of the objective externally, well, to their objective externally existent nature. In other words, the beings may not be inhabitants of other levels of reality, but rather omnipresent forces that exist outside of ourselves that we observe by means of our subjective consciousness. So if this were the case, then our invisible world's camera, rather than capturing images of localized objects, may be capturing images of more pervasive forces exerting local effects. On the other hand, our hypothetical instruments might be unable to capture any images of these external forces or objects, discrete, localized, or local representations of omnipresent forces, because perceiving them requires an interaction between them and our minds. In the case of a local manifestation of omnipresent forces, we might say that lifeless machines, or those without a soul or a mind, cannot apprehend divine influence. It is simply too subtle to be recorded objectively. Next slide. It is never too early to begin thinking about the implications of establishing the reality of the DMT beings. For example, how best to introduce this new fact to the public, and also how can we determine the value of what they are sharing with us. In other words, how can we determine whether, to paraphrase the biblical figure Joshua, if they are against us or if they are for us. Will we attempt to weaponize them, and will they attempt to weaponize us? So these are some of the same questions that come to mind when speaking about ETs and the ET phenomena. You can speculate about a spectrum of contact with ETs, either a purely consciousness to consciousness level of contact, or a more physical to physical level of contact. For the purposes of our discussion and my presentation this afternoon, it's more focused on the consciousness to consciousness aspect of the phenomena.